Welcome to Tax Notes Talk, a podcast from Tax Notes, the leading source of tax news, information, and analysis.
Welcome to the podcast. I'm David Stewart, Editor-in-Chief of Tax Notes Today International. This week, take it to the limit. On June 3rd, President Biden signed the debt limit bill into law, successfully averting what would have been the first ever U.S. government default. And although the end result passed on a bipartisan basis, there was a lot of uncertainty on both sides of the aisle leading up to it. So what's in the bill, and what should we expect next? Joining me now to talk more about this is Tax Notes reporter Alexander Rifaat. Alex, welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, Dave. Great to be back.
Why don't we start from the basics? What ended up in the final bill?
So I'm going to take your question and flip it on its head and start with what is not in this bill. So the bill does not include any elimination of the energy tax credits included in the Inflation Reduction Act that Republicans wanted to scrap. It also does not claw back the $80 billion in IRS funding that was also included in the IRA last year. However, what's also not included, but is of noteworthiness, is in a separate agreement that has been agreed to between the Biden administration and congressional Republicans to essentially claw back 25% of the $80 billion, so about $20 billion, over the next two fiscal cycles. So in terms of what is actually in the bill, in terms of what Republicans had hoped to achieve originally and what has actually been enacted, there's actually only $1.4 billion that is going to be immediately rescinded from the additional IRS funding, in addition to a number of other adjustments in terms of work requirements for certain benefits. But in terms of what is in the bill, it's actually not as much funding decrease as Republicans had initially hoped for.
All right, so could you sort of spell out for us what concessions were made by both parties as they were trying to make this agreement?
Yes, so in terms of, as I just mentioned, with the White House and the Democrats, they have agreed to at least some precision of the additional IRS funding secured last year. And for Republicans, as I mentioned, they did not get any of the energy tax credits clawed back as they originally agreed. And I think, looking at the deal, it really is a reflection of the current political makeup that we have in Washington. We have a Democrat president, a slim Democrat majority in the Senate, and a thin Republican majority in the House. So in terms of what Republicans had initially looked for in terms of their previous legislation, the Limit, Save, and Grow Act, and what has actually been agreed to between Speaker McCarthy and the president and what's become law, it really is a reflection of the current political reality we're living in. Were Republicans going to be able to extract some concessions from Democrats? Yes. Were they going to be able to get everything that they wanted? No. And I think that's reflected in this bill.
How much did they really get at the end of the day compared to what they were aiming for?
So in terms of what they Republicans had originally asked for, they'd asked for $71 billion of the $80 billion rescinded at the IRS. It looks like with adding up both what is actually being rescinded immediately, the $1.4 billion, with the extra $20 billion over the next two fiscal cycles, that amounts to about 25%. So it's not, again, as I just mentioned, it's not everything that they wanted, but I think that and that's a reflection of the political situation that we're in. For Biden and the Democrats, they were not able to hold on to all the funding that they wanted. They view the IRS funding as crucial component to their effort to raise revenues and to go after high-income tax dodgers as well as multinational corporations. So not everybody got what they wanted, and you see that reflected in the bill.
So how did the final vote play out in the House and in the Senate?
So in the House, what you had is a very interesting situation where you had, the center from basically both parties come together and pass this bill, and the more extreme elements of both parties come out against this. So you had progressive Democrats and conservative Republicans voting against this bill. Progressives such as Alexander Ocasio-Cortez claiming that the spending cuts went too far, and you have on the other side, you have Republicans claiming that the clawback of the IRS funding didn't go far enough, and so you have this situation. So you had a situation basically where the diehard sort of passionate wings of both parties unhappy with the deal, while the core coming together and getting the bill passed. I won't repeat what kind of sandwich Congressman Chip Roy described this bill, but you can definitely tell that sort of the more conservative element of the Republican Party were not happy with this agreement, and that was also seen with progressives on the left. So in the Senate, it was a much more partisan vote. A large portion of Republicans voted against the bill. So really the area of contention, the area of fierce debate really took place in the House.
All right, so now that this bill has been passed, what are we hearing from both sides about how they feel about the end result?
So both sides have really tried to portray this deal as the best outcome given the current political environment, as I mentioned, given the makeup of Congress and who is in charge of the White House. So in terms of how they're portraying this deal, it's not necessarily seeing it as a win. So both sides are trying to prop up the concessions that they were able to achieve, while also downplaying some of the concessions that they had to make.
All right, now you mentioned this side agreement about $20 billion. What really is this agreement, and what are we going to see from it?
So yeah, in terms of like I mentioned, the agreement is not in the bill. It's simply if you want to call it a gentleman's agreement between the president and Speaker McCarthy, and it calls for $10 billion again of the additional funding that was allocated to the IRS to be repurposed both in fiscal year 2024 and in fiscal year 2025. And so it's nothing been written, and it's not in law, but it's something that going into the upcoming appropriations process, we should see happening. Republicans, especially those in the Freedom Caucus, have sort of grumbled about that is not necessarily, because it's not necessarily into law, that it might not happen. Democrats are scrambling and saying that we have to find additional funding for it in order to make up for that shortfall. So it's unclear how the reappropriation will play out in the next two fiscal cycles. There hasn't been any indication of what the funds will be repurposed for, but it is understood that this $20 billion will indeed be clawed back from the funding.
What have we heard from the White House about their position on this loss of money for the IRS?
So the White House has been playing this off as a temporary setback in terms of their overall goal to remodernize the agency. Officials have said that this rescission will have no effect on the short term and medium term efforts to revitalize the agency. They did, however, say that with this funding being rescinded, that there would be potential need to come back to Congress, ask for more money down the road. So essentially kicks the can down in terms of what sort of effect the funding will have for the IRS.
So have we heard from IRS Commissioner Werfel about what it means for his agency?
Yes. So after Biden signed the deal, he expressed confidence, like the White House has, in terms of that this deal will have no bearing on the modernization efforts of the agency. He said the IRS is still on a positive trajectory. So in terms of what has been coming from the commissioner in terms of their reaction of this deal, again, just trying to take a positive spin on it.
And what's next? Is this issue actually solved all the way into 2025?
So I think the key thing to consider here is that the bill suspends the debt limit up until January 2025. So essentially, this bill lays out the political ground rules for the next year and a half of both the Congress, the makeup in Congress, and the White House. So it basically takes those concerns that both Republicans and Democrats have had, and it basically puts it on the ballot in 2024. And I think that's sort of the crucial thing to consider here, is that it's not necessarily something that is a long-term fix. It's not necessarily something that is all set in stone. It simply is as I said in the beginning, a reflection of the political reality that we're in.
Well, all right, Alex, thank you so much for being here, and we can happily not talk about debt limits for, I guess, a year and a half.
Sounds good.
And now, coming attractions. Each week we highlight new and interesting commentary in our magazines. Joining me now is Acquisitions and Engagement Editor-in-Chief, Paige Jones. Paige, what will you have for us?
Thanks, Dave. In Tax Notes Federal, Sandy Frund examines the declining submission and acceptance rates of offers in compromise. Jack Cummings examines the taxation of private school vouchers in light of the IRS's announcement of a waiver for potential taxation of state pandemic payments. In Tax Notes State, Timothy Noonan and Mario Cato discussed New York budget highlights, as well as successes and failures in a range of New York tax proposals. Robert Willens discusses the significance of establishing domicile in New York tax law. He explains how federal rules and case law for determining income can inform application of the state law. In Tax Notes International, Theophilus Tawia compares the benefits and challenges associated with different collaborative tax strategies to combat climate change globally. 4 KPMG practitioners examine the transfer pricing issues that companies should take into account in their ESG-related tax planning. And finally, in featured analysis, Nana Amasarfo discusses how a recent IMF paper on anti-money laundering measures and tax crimes is important for tax compliance and domestic revenue mobilization.
That's it for this week. You can follow me online at TaxStew, that's STEW, and be sure to follow at TaxNotes for all things tax. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for a future episode, you can email us at podcast@taxanalyst.org. And as always, if you like what we're doing here, please leave a rating or review wherever you download this podcast. We'll be back next week with another episode of Tax Notes Talk.
Tax Notes Talk is a production of Tax Notes. You can learn more about us by visiting www.taxnotes.com/podcast. When major media wants the straight story, they turn to Tax Notes. Thank you for listening, and join us again for another edition of Tax Notes Talk.
Want to see more like this? Subscribe for more tax videos. Special thanks to our executive producers, Jasper Smith and Paige Jones, as well as showrunner and audio engineer Jordan Parrish.